Good morning, everybody. Dr. Kim, thank you not just for the kind introduction, but also the very succinct homework assignment that in your capacity as a professor you've just given to Richard and myself. On behalf of Richard, who I think is well known to many of you here, I want to just say how deeply appreciative we are for all of you coming out early this morning to enter into this discussion, how grateful we are to the Korea Foundation, both for its hospitality today and also the support that you and your predecessors have given to our work. And by the way, that means not just work that we've been able to do locally and regionally, but globally as well. Because the Tip O'Neill line can be flipped around. All politics is global as well. And that's, I think, part of our theme here today. As I look around this room, I see an opportunity to make some new friends. And I also see some old friends. Tom, I'm looking at you. Tom Hubbard was a real mentor of mine during the 8 years that Bill Clinton gave me a chance to impersonate a diplomat. He's a real pro and helped me particularly understand this region, a region that I've been coming to since my days as a journalist going back to the 1970s. And as for Kim Young-hee, we had an adventure together in 1990. We were part of a multinational delegation that traveled from Japan to the far east of a country that no longer exists. You may dimly remember there was such a country. It was called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And it was an extraordinary trip. When Lord was along, Alan Lomberg, quite a number of people known to many of you. But one of the things that sticks in my mind, I'd be interested if, Mr. Kim, you have the same recollection, is that the South Korean delegation were the stars of the show. They were the ones, not the Americans, not the Japanese, emphatically not the North Koreans. The South Koreans had all kinds of special hospitality lavished on them, which I think in itself was significant. It indicated the extent to which the government in Moscow at that time was looking to this country as it emerged as a major economic power to help in the development of what was then the Soviet Far East. A lot has changed. A large country now known as the Russian Federation's need for cultivating what I thought I would do by way of sort of setting the stage for what Richard is going to say, and he's particularly well qualified to address the topic that we've been assigned, because in addition to his very distinguished service in the executive branch of the United States government, he also was a very influential, dedicated member of the congressional staff, and in particular worked intimately with Steve Solars. Well, I'm sorry to have to now say the late Steve Solars. As you know, he died in recent days, in great sadness to many of us, in this room particularly to Richard. What I thought I would do by way of framing the issue is to refer to two visits to this neighborhood that are associated with the names of American presidents, the 44th and the 1st. It was just about 3 weeks ago that the 44th President of the United States came here to Seoul. And that was part of a trip that had been planned well in advance of the midterm elections. President Obama hoped to use that trip to Asia to convey to the people of the region, to the people of the world, and to the people of the United States his commitment to the proposition that while, of course, all politics, in order to be effective, must be rooted in sensitivity to local and national concerns, particularly in this era of globalization, we have to make a virtue out of the interdependence among nations. That was the big theme that he wanted to convey on that trip. And the itinerary kind of speaks for itself. Remember, he went to 4 nations in that trip. And those 4 nations had one thing in common. They were all democracies. India, Indonesia, Japan, and Korea. 2 of the 4 are close and crucial allies of the United States, Japan and the Republic of Korea. One of those nations is the largest Muslim nation on the planet. Its very existence as such is a reminder that there is no inherent contradiction between economic modernization, and democracy on the one hand, and a largely Islamic population on the other. As for India, it's one of the 2 countries on Earth with a population of more than 1 billion people, and it's not China, and it's a democracy. So there, and of course, one of the reasons that President Bush came to Japan and Korea was because relatively new manifestations of global governance were underway in both of those countries. APEC and, of course, the G20, which you were hosting here. So he had a very high-tone global agenda. But as Lenin famously said, and I'm referring to John Lennon, life is what happens while you're making other plans. And on the way to Andrews Air Force Base, as it were, to take off on that trip, we had the midterm elections, which were not catastrophic necessarily for President Obama's ability to deliver on the promise and hope of his election in 2008, but a pretty significant setback and a requirement for him to use the trip as much as possible to follow the Tip O'Neill adage that Dr. Kim mentioned at the outset, and that is address a nervous, dissatisfied, fearful American electorate and citizenry. And he tried to do that in various ways. I happened to have been in India just before he arrived in Mumbai. And I was there in India at the time that the midterm election results became known. And I have friends who were preparing the way for President Obama's trip, and they were scrambling to maximize the extent to which he was able to use that part of the trip to ensure Americans back in the United States that he wasn't just getting out of town and going off on diplomatic tourism. He was actually going to be doing things that were going to help the American economy and specifically help address what is the most politically valent and dangerous issue in the American economy right now, which is unemployment. So he used his speech in Mumbai to reassure the, whatever it was, 200 or so American businessmen who were there and the Americans who were watching on TV, that the U.S.-Indian economic relationship was not about outsourcing jobs to India. It was about investment opportunities in India, also attracting Indian capital to the United States for investment in ways that would improve the job situation. Now, when he got out to this part of the world, and I hardly need to dwell on this because you all know the issues so well, he had some reminders about how difficult his task was, both domestically and internationally. He hoped very much that his bilateral meeting with President Lee was going to result in a breakthrough on the ROK-U.S. free trade agreement, and What happened, of course, was a disappointment, and I would say something of an embarrassment, probably to both presidents, but I can only speak with knowledge about the American president. It was a considerable setback, and all the more so because it was more or less simultaneous with a high degree of criticism, resentment, and pushback from the other G20 members against the way in which the United States government is trying to jumpstart and accelerate economic recovery in the United States. And in particular, controversy, of course, was the Federal Reserve's decision to do QE2, quantitative easing, so-called, in a way that riled up many of the other participants, particularly the Germans, but others as well. In fact, I think the Indians were one of the few participating delegations that didn't, in one way or another, criticize this action by the U.S. government, which, of course, came from an independent agency of the U.S. government, not from the executive branch, and the timing was the substantive merits can be debated by policymakers, economists. They're being debated right now by Brookings economists back in Washington, but the political timing was difficult. And indeed, I don't think I will ever forget the headline on the front page of the New York Times when, on a day that President Obama thought he would get a photo op and news coverage that would remind the American people that he is still an immensely respected and influential leader of the world. The headline, which ran again across 4 columns of the New York Times, was "Obama's Economic Vision Rejected on World Stage." That is, to put it mildly, major loss of message control, as they call it in the White House. So this was a tough experience for him. Now, my own view is that, in fact, the G20 was quite a positive meeting in ways that we can talk about, and I suspect Richard will touch upon in his own remarks shortly. But to have the combination of what was seen as a failure on the part of presidential diplomacy with regard to the FTA and the unpopularity of U.S. policy at the G20 had President Obama in the position of the back of the United States with all the clearer sense of how tough a job he has ahead of us. And Richard will speak to some of the specifics in that regard, but I would just make a general comment and then a specific comment with regard to the crucial importance of the ROK-U.S. relationship in, shall I say, steadying out the course of the Obama presidency. Generally speaking, the 44th President of the United States is a pragmatist. And while committed to the ideal of nonpartisanship, he has had the most bracing reminders that bipartisanship is going to be exceedingly difficult over the next 2 years. And one of the most important things is the way in which he will maintain his commitment to bipartisan cooperation when it's possible, and his recognition that much of what he's going to have to do will have to be in the absence of bipartisanship. For example, on climate and energy, an issue where the ROK and the U.S. have been working very closely together. We have the opening of the Cancun talks. I think there, the U.S. government is going to have to rely primarily on actions that it can take solely through the executive branch and our regulatory agencies as opposed to legislation. But there are going to be some issues where I think we will continue to see bipartisanship. And one of those is on the need to not just preserve, but find new ways of strengthening the U.S.-ROK relationship. And Dr. Kim, of course, alluded to the extremely dangerous events in recent days perpetrated by your neighbors to the north. And this brings me to my final mention of the other recent visit to the region, and that is by George Washington, the vessel, not the individual, of course. But I think that this public display, not just of hard power, American hard power and South Korean hard power, but also this public display of the extent to which these two military forces are working hand in hand to deter and, if necessary, respond to further provocations or aggressions from the north is extremely important in its own right. One thing that we should talk about is what we can do together to make sure that another major player in the region, which is to say the People's Republic of China, plays a, shall I put it, a more unambiguous or less ambiguous role in what it has to say on the subject of North Korean behavior. I'm quite confident that issue will be high on the agenda of the summit between President Obama and President Hu Jintao in January. But I do think that if there is ever any silver lining at all in this dark cloud that passed over your horizon here in the last week or so, is that it has reminded the entire world about what the dangers are, how important it is that the U.S. and the ROK work together, and I would even cautiously hazard the guess that what has happened may increase support in the new United States Congress for the free trade agreement. Richard can speak with great knowledge about this. The fact is that while the new Republican majority in the House of Representatives is going to be committed to blocking President Obama on many issues, I think there's some chance of hoping that that will not be the case on the issue of the FTA. I know from one of the reasons that Richard and I incur jet lag in order to come to meetings like this is so that we can learn from all of you about your local politics. But we've been here long enough to understand that ratification of an FTA is not a slam dunk in the National Assembly here. It is certainly not a slam dunk in the United States Congress, but I think there is a pretty decent chance that for the reasons that I've mentioned, it will indeed get through. So with that, I would, Dr. Kim, ask that you let me sit down and we hear from Richard.